Hello, welcome back to episode 13 of my Stuarts vlog. Last time we talked about Anglicanism, and this time it's going to be fear of Catholicism, the second strand of the religion theme. And next time we'll be talking about dissent and nonconformity. Like the Anglican stuff I did last time, you're unlikely, very unlikely, I would say, to get a whole question on fear of Catholicism. I haven't seen one that has been asked like that. However, I have seen questions involving the fear of Catholicism, normally around the Restoration. And they go something like, was fear of Catholicism the main cause of problems for Charles II? And of course, it would be quite straightforward to include James II in that as well. But you won't get a question just about James II and Catholicism because of the 10-year rule that says they can't ask a question that is narrower than 10 years in time frame. So what I'm going to do though here is give you that kind of overview like I did last time with Anglicanism on the fear of Catholicism, where it comes from, where it bubbles up, why it bubbles up, and then why it kind of really explodes during that restoration phase. So very quickly, where does it come from? I think the first thing you need to remember is that when we talk about fear of Catholicism, we're thinking about fear of a religion. Now, people at the time were also thinking of fear of religion. They were dubious about people's loyalty to the Pope back in Rome, and they were perhaps concerned that Catholics were more loyal to the Pope than to their own nation and to their own monarch. However, there is also a linking of Catholicism with foreign powers, and particularly with foreign enemies. Both France and Spain were Catholic countries, and both France and Spain were traditional enemies and current enemies of England at this time. You have to remember that in 1625, people could still look back upon events, particularly old people or younger people, events that their parents or grandparents might have told them about, and have this idea about a Catholic plot against the country. In 1570, the Pope had actually said that Catholics should work for the death of Elizabeth I, for the murder of Elizabeth I. In 1587, Mary Queen of Scots had been executed for being a Catholic, the kind of head of a Catholic plot to take over the crown. In 1588, Spain had tried to invade using the Spanish Armada. And then in 1604, the Gunpowder Plot had been, again, a Catholic plot to literally blow up Parliament and all the politicians and the monarch, and to replace them with a Catholic state. And go back to being England as a Catholic country. So there were good reasons really to think that Catholics really were plotting. It's not just kind of complete fanciful paranoia. Also, within the Charles I's reign, there were good reasons to fear that he was directing the country back towards Catholicism through firstly through his religious policy, which we've looked at before. William Laud looks quite Catholic. He wasn't, as I've said, and if you told him, oh, you look a bit Catholic, he would have been pretty cross with you. He would say, no, I'm Protestant, I'm an Arminian, but I draw the line at Catholicism. However, he did look quite Catholic, and there were fears that's the direction of travel that Charles I was encouraging. Secondly, he spent time with a lot of Catholics. Obviously, his wife was Catholic, Henrietta Maria, Catholic French princess, who was not just sort of tokenly Catholic, was very Catholic, came over with a hat full of Catholic priests to minister to her, and was bringing up their children, Charles and James, to be Catholics as well, or at least be aware of Catholicism. Which is one of the things that the Long Parliament tries to stamp out in the early 1640s that annoys and upsets Charles I. Richard Weston was a Catholic. He was the Lord Treasurer during personal rule and cooked up some of those financial wizzo schemes to keep the country going. You'll remember perhaps that Charles I sold a monopoly to the soap company to provide one soap for England, and that company was partly owned by Catholics too. So he had kind of Catholic friends and Catholic influences around him, and that didn't reflect well on him amongst those people who were already feeling suspicious about Catholicism. The third thing to say about him, so his religious policy looked a bit Catholic, he had Catholic friends and influences, and the third thing is it behaved in quite a stereotypical Catholic absolutist way. He didn't like to listen to debate. He didn't like to engage in discussion. He certainly didn't like to compromise, as you see, before the Civil War, but also after the Civil War as well. So he kind of he had that look of Catholicism about him. However, there wasn't really a plot to bring back Catholicism at that stage, and it's fair to say that it was really just the Puritans who were kind of predisposed to worry about that sort of thing that were particularly concerned about it. The fear of Catholicism seems to kind of take a back seat during the Republican era. There is a war against Spain. It's fought mostly at sea. It involves the capture of Jamaica, which is how we kind of flag it up. Obviously, Spain's a big Catholic country. That war is quite popular amongst Parliament, particularly if you fight it at sea rather than on land. But apart from that, not really much kind of anti-Catholicism stuff going on. Although, of course, tolerance is not extended to Catholics. I mean, that goes without saying, right? Hey, there's only so far you can push tolerance. So the fear of Catholicism really kind of explodes back in the Restoration. And even then, it's kind of slow to come about. General Monk does advise Charles II to leave Catholic territory and head for Protestant lands before he returns to England. That's where the Declaration of Breda comes from the Protestant Netherlands rather than Catholic-held Spanish lands. I think he was in before that. And, of course, he had spent quite a lot of time in France during his exile. But it's not like there's not an immediate kind of fear of Catholicism as soon as Charles II comes back by any means. It really seems to be that things start to unravel around Charles II's relationship with France. So he sells Dunkirk to the French, I think in 1665. And then you get the Great Fire of London in 1666, where people start to say, well, maybe a Catholic maybe started this. Of course, they hadn't, but it sort of illustrates how that fear is present. And then in the late 1680s, 60s rather, 1668, and leading up to 1670, when the Secret Treaty of Dover is signed, there's this start of this relationship between Louis the XIV and Charles II, where there are fears and concerns about Charles II, again, like his dad, moving England towards being a Catholic absolutist country. Now, those fears are only given credence by the conversion of James to Catholicism. That was in 1668, or publicly turns to Catholicism in 1668. And that sort of provokes the Test Act. Now, the Test Act of 1672 was an act which made sure that if you wanted to take public office, you had to swear an oath of allegiance, but also an oath that that basically denied transubstantiation being accurate. Now, this is one of the things that Catholics believe that Protestants really don't, that when you take the bread and wine at Mass or communion, that it literally inside you becomes the blood of Jesus and the body of Jesus, this idea really of Jesus living within you and I guess, then influencing you and making you more like Jesus, which is a laudable aim. But to swear that you think this is nuts is obviously very offensive to Catholics. And so the 1672 Test Act meant that James, Duke of York at the time, James II, to be resigned from his position in the Navy. Clifford resigned from his position as the See of the Cabal. And in general, Catholics were persecuted kind of out of any positions in public life. I would say that is the point at which you start to see the fear of Catholicism become a prominent thing within the political story that we look at. 1673, James married Mary of Modena. And then in 1678, you get the Popish plot, this made-up plot that was supposed to exist. The plot was to get rid of Charles II and bring James, his Catholic brother, onto the throne. Now, that is completely nuts and made up. However, the fervour with which it's believed and the fear with which it takes hold, I think really illustrates both that fear of Catholicism is a big thing, but also that it was kind of already there. It would be extraordinary if it just exploded from nothing to that. So the fear of Catholicism kind of, I think it's suggested, is like dry sticks waiting for that match. And the Popish plot really is that match. Following hard on the heels of that, you then get the exclusion crisis, where Parliament tried to take that fear of Catholicism and use it to ensure that no Catholic can become king. And that really leads to conflict between Charles II and Parliament. The conflict is both over his family loyalty to his brother, but also to his ideas about what being a king is and how you become a king, and Charles' notions of divine right and the way that God was selecting the monarch rather than Parliament. So the fear of Catholicism really does kind of explode in that era, and I think it's societal. I don't think we can really explain it fully, but we kind of illustrate it through these key events that happened. However, you must remember in the fear of Catholicism thing the fact that James II becomes king in 1685, and I think this is really like your go-to fact for saying that fear of Catholicism had its limits, that they were willing to accept it. Not only that, but they were willing to ignore and put aside Monmouth and his revolt. Monmouth's revolt is really pathetic when it comes over. And Monmouth had been a very popular illegitimate son of Charles II, but no one was suggesting that they should go for the illegitimate Protestant over the legitimate Catholic heir. And so I think this really shows that that fear of Catholicism is perhaps something that affects the lower classes, perhaps more than the upper classes. It's convenient sometimes for the upper classes, and then perhaps also that it's something that is used by the upper classes to try and make trouble for different reasons. That said, of course, James II pushes things too far, and in a number of ways he really does try to push England towards Catholicism through his declarations of indulgence, through letting Catholics become army officers. He recreates a church called the Court of Ecclesiastical Commission in 1686, and he uses that to try and put Catholic magistrates in place and Catholic fellows in Oxford University. And then, of course, he tries to force the 7 bishops and a load of other bishops and priests and things to read out the Declaration of Indulgence, and ends up with egg all over his face. The final straw, of course, is the birth of his son, because people were willing to put up with an aging Catholic monarch who could do a little bit of damage and run amok for a few years, but they were not willing to put up with the idea of a Catholic succession. And so maybe at the end, this does show that fear of Catholicism was more about a choice that people were making, that they did not want England to return to Catholicism. And so in 1688, because of his Catholicism, but also because of the way that he'd pushed that Catholicism, they act against James II and invite William of Orange to come over and restore a Protestant nation. I hope that makes sense, and I'll see you next time when we talk about dissent. Thanks for watching.